Okay. Thank you for joining us today. Sorry for the delay. We're going to move things along to make sure that you all have time to go out after this, and so we'll stick to time. So thank you for joining us today in Resisting Regressions 2, Strengthening Social Work Science and Collaboration amid Anti-DEI and Anti-Democratic Initiatives. I'm Justin Harty from Arizona State University, and I'm honored to serve as your moderator for this important session. Last year, in Resisting Regression 1, Drs. Blackdeer, Abramovitz, Sheely, and Laguna-Pena and I discussed the impact of anti-DEI and anti-democratic initiatives on social work research, proposing counter strategies to address these challenges. Surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, the situation has since deteriorated, amplifying the need for yet another important conversation today. So the focus of our panel is urgent and vital. So today, what we'll discuss again is another rising tide of anti-higher ed, democracy, and attacks on DEI initiatives that undermine anti-racist, anti-colonial, and democratic principles, stifling diversity. Then these create challenges that ultimately jeopardize the integrity of social work science and compromise our shared commitment to justice and equity. So to guide our exploration for today's panel, we welcome back Dr. Mimi Abramovitz from Hunter College, who will shed light on attacks on higher ed and their implications for social work research. Dr. Connor from the University of Pittsburgh, who will discuss the pervasive challenges posed by anti-DEI initiatives and their impact on our field and communities we serve. And Dr. Nepomnyaschy, Lenna, who will delve into the consequences of anti-democratic initiatives and how they undermine participatory decision-making and open dialogue. And so together we'll discuss these threats and some actionable strategies to confront them. And so with that, I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Mimi Abramovitz, who will be joining us remotely today. Mimi?
Thank you, Justin, and thank you all. I'm glad to be able to join you if it's only by Zoom. My voice is a little hoarse, so I hope you can bear with that. As co-chair of the National Social Work Voter Mobilization Campaign, better known as Voting is Social Work, and as a social work educator, I have often asked myself, how is democracy doing? The data provided for the 2023 Democracy Index, calculated by The Economist, tells us what marginalized groups have always known. That is, we cannot take a functioning democracy for granted. The DI ranks 167 countries from 0 to 10 based on 5 measures of democracy, and it places the countries in one of 4 categories: a full democracy or a flawed democracy, or a hybrid regime or an authoritarian regime. And according to this report, the U.S. democracy is surely in trouble. The ranking by years, we ranked as a full democracy in 2006 with a score of 8.22. From 2016 to 2024, we ranked as a flawed democracy with progressively lower scores. Only 8% of the world's population lives in a full democracy, which is really something to think about. Norway, with a score of 9.81, is the highest. U.S. falls behind Canada and England. Not surprisingly, 2/3 of Americans don't think our democracy is working very well. They're not dumb. The DI concludes that the U.S. sits between democracy and authoritarianism, which has very much been in the news these days. While shocking, as it should be, this assessment is not new. The U.S. has experienced authoritarian periods before, including the Red Scares following World War I and McCarthyism after World War II. Now, given the passage of time, many U.S. social workers know very little about this history, or may, and the extent to which social workers resisted and/or complied. Unfortunately, these troubling events have now caught up with us. The guardrails of democracy, namely fair elections, the independent press, public education, and an unbiased Supreme Court, among others, are faltering. And, I'm sad to say, the opponents of democracy are intentional and strategic. So here's what I mean. First came the vote. Over the past decades, democracy's foes have installed legal structures to block the vote at all levels of government, especially for Black and brown people. This includes the well-known voter suppression, gerrymandering, and overriding election results, among other barriers. The opponents know that elections are often won by small margins. You know that too, and that just a few suppressed votes can make a big difference in ballot outcomes and future policy agendas. But it's not just the vote. They are also targeting other important venues. Following the authoritarian playbook, they are actively, what I say, they are dumbing down the public by banning books, buying out local newspapers, and attacking higher education. So for books, since July 21, states have banned some 16,000 books, 16,000, a 200% increase in 1 year. Most bans target controversial subjects and marginalized voices. Less press. Newspapers are vanishing at an average rate of more than 2 a week. Since 2005, the country has lost almost 3,000 newspapers, with only 6,000 remaining. Between 2005 and 24, the nation lost 66% or 43 journalists. Meanwhile, large media corporations own 80% of all daily newspapers. Today, not surprisingly, only 45% of Americans trust the news media to report fairly. And how about higher education? From the voting booth to the newsroom, the attack on democracy has spread to us, that is, the classroom. Yes, higher education is also under attack, as you probably already know or have experienced, as the training ground for research, teaching, community collaboration, and a key pathway to the civic engagement and informed public discourse. Education shores up democracy. But, therefore, the foes of democracy want to clean up, in quotes, their word, the high school and college curriculum, especially when it comes to CRT and DEI, open debate, and academic freedom. So here's the question. Why do democracy's opponents work so hard to undermine it? Well, they know that dumbing down the public silences many voices, especially marginalized groups, and that this allows a small number of people with an outsized voice to install their anti-democratic, if not authoritarian agenda. This is what we're up against. They know that an uninformed public is less equipped to resist their efforts. So they developed an effective three-pronged strategy in the attack on higher education. Following this authoritarian playbook, the anti-democratic lawmakers, they target individuals, then programs, and then institutional structures. And this is very important. And this is familiar to me. I first recognized this because they use the same tripartite template to attack voting rights. PEN America, a writers' advocacy group, refers to the following silencing efforts in education as an educational gag order. First, the government pressures universities to silence, fire, or not hire outspoken, often popular individual faculty who advocate for CRT and DEI. Next, they press universities to cut diversity programs, including classes, diversity statements, anti-bias trainings, DEI centers, and more. Third, they target institutions, including university funding, tenure, and accreditation. These are the very governance structures that support the academic freedom, which allows us to explore unpopular ideas in our research, teaching, and to work with needed integrity with communities fighting oppression. Many of you may have experienced some of these. It depends on what state you live in, but we're all feeling the pressure. The overall attack on higher education threatens the profession itself. It erodes the trust between teachers and students, faculty and administration, as well as researchers and community partners who are needed if social workers are to co-create knowledge and to address the rights of the most dispossessed. And sadly, these tactics and strategy are having an impact. Policies have been enacted. In 2023, lawmakers introduced 207 anti-DEI bills, up from 137 in 22 and 54 in 21. As of August 2024, 28 states had 86 bills on the books, with more punitive ones in the wings. These laws could affect more than 100,000 public college and university faculty, which includes many in this room. Like voter suppression, the attack on DEI is highly racialized. It represents still another backlash against the gains won, especially by persons of color. Like affirmative action, politicians make CRT and DEI a rallying cry or a dog whistle, hoping to reverse progress that challenged white, male, class, and heterosexual supremacy. Some refer to these anti-DEI efforts as viewpoint discrimination. Penn refers to them as ed scares. That's ed scares like Red Scares, or the most severe intrusion into free expression on campuses since the McCarthy Red Scare in the 50s. During such ed scares, the government imposes ideological control over what we can read, learn, research, and teach, and advocate for. Now, then there's self-censorship. Ed scares thrive on the fear that can lead to self-censorship, also known as the chilling effect or anticipatory obedience. When faced with vague, difficult to interpret laws, we, us, faculty, and others, understandably steer clear of any words, deeds, people, and groups that we think might get us in trouble. To be safe, we may voluntarily give up some of our academic freedom. And our fears are not unfounded. A 2022 survey by the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression found that faculty limit or change their speech, syllabi, research, community partners, and otherwise silence themselves to protect their reputation, funding, publications, community alliances, and their jobs, our jobs. The survey of faculty reported that 91% reported at least being somewhat likely to self-censor. 34% experienced peer pressure to avoid controversial research. 25% reported being very or extremely likely to self-censor. 16% faced threats or were actually disciplined for what they said or wrote. Only 8% said they do not self-censor at all. The same for university administrators who, to protect their budgets, review syllabi, cancel classes, close DEI programs, and urge faculty to proceed with caution. Now, these surveys were national surveys, and they probably did include social work education, or they may have, but we don't know. But we are very vulnerable. Why? We are housed in targeted public institutions. We work with marginalized populations and are committed to social, economic, racial, and gender justice. Accreditation may not protect us. We think it might, but watch out. When speaking of education, Trump called accreditation his secret weapon. So, although I can't see you, can we have a show of hands of those in the room who have experienced this chilling effect? Okay, I assume Lots of hands went up. If someone can give me a clue about that later, I'd like to know. But also, be on the lookout for our survey, which you will receive soon, asking you about your experiences with the attack on DEI. Timothy Schneider, who coined the phrase anticipatory obedience, suggests that such voluntary compliance fuels authoritarianism. By self-censoring, we make it appear that we voluntarily decided to stop our DEI work. This effectively hides the role of government mandates and sanctions. Lawmakers hope the sheet will take them off the hook, and it may, but it may not protect our jobs, research grants, community ties, reputations, or academic freedom. And by the way, this notion of academic obedience was discussed in the lead op-ed in today's New York Times. You may want to check it out. It's quite frightening. If Project 2025 is any measure, democracy's foes will go even further. Written by the Heritage Foundation for Trump's second term, Project 2025 calls for abolishing the Department of Education, as I'm sure you've heard, as well as firing thousands of public sector workers, including many social workers. This loss of democratic institutions does not happen all at once. It is more like death by 1,000 cuts and has been going on for quite some time. Now it's going to be full force. In isolation, each incremental erosion seems inconsequential or gets normalized, but the ongoing impact is dangerously cumulative. And once in place, anti-democratic changes become very difficult to reverse. And I'd like to conclude by saying that American democracy and higher education stand at a precipice today. We face many challenges. The risks of non-compliance are high. Failure to comply with this war on faculty and university independence risks government-driven retaliation, prosecution, defunding, job loss, and other harsh penalties. But the risks of compliance are also quite high. We lose when the public accepts that it's okay for the government to tell us what to do, think, study, and understand. We lose when social work tolerates state actions that violate professional and humane standards, jeopardize the integrity of our teaching and research, disrupt collaborative bonds with communities, and violate the profession's commitment to a just and equitable society. Democracy is not promised. It has to be practiced, protected, fought for, and passed on to the next generation. So I'll end with an adaptation of this famous statement or quote. First, they came for CRT and DEI, and I did not speak out. Then they came for academic freedom, and I did not speak out. Finally, they came for democracy, and there was no one left to speak for or protect it. We win when we align and fight for democracy. If not now, when? And we'll discuss what we can do during the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mimi. Mimi referenced a study. Dr. Mimi Abramovitz and I we've created a study that's going through the IRB on the effects of faculty's experiences with DEI that we'll be sending out to academic circles shortly. So I'd like to pass it to Dr. Connor, who will talk about the effect of anti-DEI initiatives.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. It certainly is an extreme honor to be invited to be here with my esteemed colleagues and panelists to talk about something critically important that is impacting all of us. I am certain that there is no one in this room that is unaware of the current threat to diversity, equity, and inclusion and the rise of anti-DEI policies and legislation that is sweeping across higher education, although depending upon where you are sitting in the world geographically, as well as the funding structure of your institution, it may impact how felt those experiences are, how much it is impacting your ability to do your work, to engage in meaningful and effective research collaborations, your ability to hire and retain faculty and students from underrepresented backgrounds, and importantly, how safe you feel and your sense of belonging in your individual institutions. But the reality is that this anti-DEI movement is impacting all of us, regardless of whether we are in states that have formal anti-DEI policies. And a federal DEI ban, which could be on the horizon for us, could bring DEI restrictions into all of our backyards. And so it is critical that as social work educators, scholars, practitioners, and researchers, we are prepared and we have a plan for moving forward. Justin mentioned just a moment ago that I'm currently at the University of Pittsburgh, where I'm the Donald M. Henderson Professor and the Director of the Center on Race and Social Problems, and currently serving as the Associate Dean for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. But before rejoining the University of Pittsburgh faculty in 2023, I spent 10 years as a tenured professor at the University of South Florida in Tampa. I held a few different DEI roles there as a special assistant on DEI to our Dean of College of Behavioral and Community Sciences. I was also the inaugural chair of our Faculty Senate Council on Racial Justice and served in very close proximity to our president and vice chancellor for DEI. I also had some political involvement there where I was working with senators and had to work closely with Governor Ron DeSantis as he signed a bill that I wrote into law in 2021 to restructure the Florida Office of Minority Health and Health Equity. And I was in these roles when we began to be bombarded with piece of legislation after legislation attacking DEI, first attacking critical race theory, and then attacking what we can and could not speak about in the classroom, and then attacks on queer faculty and them being told they couldn't identify their gender or their sexuality in the classroom. And then there were book bans. And then we couldn't have courses that had diversity or race in the title. And then ultimately we saw the complete elimination of all DEI roles and offices in all public institutions in Florida. And as I look back on my 10-year time in Florida, all of my colleagues have lost their positions. All of the ones who didn't lose their jobs have left Florida. And every single program that I had a hand in creating to support students of color, to support gender and ethnic minority students, they no longer exist. It is a stark reality that we are living in. And I share that briefly, and I know I don't have a lot of time, Justin, but I think it's important to highlight my positionality with regard to this topic because I come to this with more than just my own sort of knowledge and research that I've done on this, but my own personal experience with the real impact that these pieces of legislation can have. So I'm going to do my very best in the next 7 or 8 minutes to talk a little bit more about where we are in terms of the current threats to DEI and some of the implications that we're seeing for that with respect to social work research. And Mimi just did a really great job of giving you some of those numbers. But I do want to highlight a couple things that we're seeing interesting in these pieces of legislation because they tend to target one or more of 4 very specific things. The first being DEI offices and roles. The second being diversity statements for hiring and admission. The third being mandatory DEI trainings. And then the fourth being identity-based preferences. So this is any kind of program or policy that places preferential treatment or some sort of additional guarantees for people with specific identities. 2024 was a really challenging year for DEI. We saw some of our largest corporations, including Walmart, have their DEI programs just completely fall apart this past year. We saw specific laws in states like Alabama, Iowa, and Utah completely eliminate their DEI offices at public institutions, joining Florida and Texas, Gabrielle. I know we've been talking about this. We also saw laws in Idaho, Indiana, and Kansas passed laws prohibiting universities from using DEI statements, and many, many more laws that were brought into the forum but not passed just yet. One of the other interesting things to note is some of the changes in the more recent bills in comparison to what we were seeing when these bills first started in 2022. Some of those original bills were attacking things like critical race theory and what we could talk about in the classroom. There was a rhetoric around the impact that this was having, vilifying white people, making white students uncomfortable. This was the language. But what we saw is that those bills were not particularly effective, and there were very powerful fights highlighting academic freedom, lawsuits that prevented those bills from really having widespread impact. And so just like a game of chess, they changed their strategy. They changed focus. And now these bills are targeting DEI offices and roles, targeting DEI trainings, targeting culturally focused centers, many of which house some of our most powerful DEI research and funding, basically undercutting the entire infrastructure that's allowing us to do important DEI-related work. And the rhetoric, too, has also changed. The rhetoric is no longer focused on the comfort of white students, but instead is painting a picture of DEI programs as being a waste of taxpayer dollars, as being unhelpful, unfair, and discriminatory, and even racist. And unfortunately, this rhetoric is working. People are believing it, and their strategy is having an impact. And again, the impact of these most recent bills have reached far beyond the states that have actually passed DEI laws. In fact, the Chronicle is looking also at all the institutions where they are seeing changes in DEI initiatives, and many institutions are doing things that are not part of any state ban at all. They are preemptively making decisions to eliminate DEI offices, to cut DEI roles, to eliminate DEI programs. We saw this in Missouri, Kentucky, and Nebraska, where in all three of their flagship institutions, they eliminated their DEI offices voluntarily. What is going on? Why are we seeing this happen? These anti-DEI initiatives that directly challenge the inclusion of diverse voices and perspectives that are so essential to collaborative social work research, and that undermine directly our anti-racist, anti-colonial, and democratic principles in academia, all come on the heels of these companies and very same academic institutions very publicly pledging their robust support for diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts just after the murder of George Floyd in 2020. Where we also saw a national social justice movement. So the backlash against DEI in many ways feels like a very strong pendulum swing from 2020, even though we all know that DEI initiatives have been around a lot longer than that. But after the murder of George Floyd and the murder of other innocent Black Americans that year, we saw an exponential surge in DEI trainings, conversations, and offices and roles. In fact, between 2019 and 2022, Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer roles grew by about 170%. I feel, and we've been talking a little bit about this, that this pushback is because we were making progress. We were doing some things right, and that made some people very scared. This renewed focus and energy catapulted DEI into the political sphere, and DEI became one of the defining and most politically divisive issues of 2023-24, a political lightning rod for lawmakers and corporate leaders and conservative activists who have in many ways successfully portrayed DEI initiatives as ineffective and a waste of taxpayer dollars and unfair and even racist. But we also know that it is clear that these DEI attacks are rooted in anti-Black racism and in queer hate. One of the reasons that this has worked is because the voices of those pushing out misinformation are louder than the voices pushing out truth. That is part of our responsibility as social workers. And as we get to the talk about solutions, we'll talk more about how we can be doing that, because the reality is people often fear what they don't understand. And a lot of people don't know what DEI is, what it stands for, and how it is benefiting our society. And we have allowed others to take hold of that narrative, and we need to take that narrative back. We're also seeing a lot of decisions being made on college campuses out of fear. University administrators that I talk to talk about sort of trying to align with this tactic that if we stay silent on these issues, or if we do some of the things that we're afraid might happen, that maybe we could prevent something even worse from happening. And this is part of what also has given this movement power. These initiatives and policies are unclear, they are poorly written, they are deeply chaotic, and thus they breed fear. It becomes challenging to know what you can do and what you can't do, and in many ways, this lack of clarity is intentional, and what we have seen this year is likely to increase in the year ahead of us. Despite a lot of anti-DEI pushback that these bills have received, it is highly unlikely that the momentum is going to slow down. Several state legislatures have already talked about their plans to refile anti-DEI bills. Our president-elect, Donald Trump, has talked about vowing to wipe out federally funded diversity programs. And if you remember, he did this once before. President Biden took that away. But it is likely to come back with a vengeance. And we also know that this debate over DEI is likely to re-enter the classroom space in 2025, with many states talking about their inspiration from Florida, yet again, and the changes that have been made there now to general education courses with language that now states that courses that involve identity politics or that teach that systemic racism, sexism, oppression, and privilege are inherent in our institutions cannot be used for general education credits. And we've already seen bills, censorship bills like this be brought out, one in Alabama, it's already under a lawsuit currently. And we're also likely going to see more universities making decisions that are not required by their state yet have significant implications. I know I'm running out of time, but I want to give you one quick example that popped up on my feed earlier this week. I'm sorry, Gabrielle. Texas A&M University, another Texas university, this week said that it was going to no longer cover the cost to send representatives to a conference. This is the PhD project, which is a conference that is designed specifically to provide support to historically underrepresented students. And this has historically, for Texas A&M and many other institutions in Texas, been a beneficial site for the recruitment of underrepresented doctoral students. But that institution received a barrage of threats on social media, including some from the governor of Texas that said that he was going to threaten to fire the president of Texas A&M University. And just that quick, they removed all funding from anyone to attend this conference at this university. All the other Texas universities that had once supported this conference removed their support. And there was a statement that if anyone from that university attended the conference, that they would have to do so on their own dime and eliminate themselves from identifying themselves as a representative of a Texas A&M institution. What's really important to highlight about this is that there are no requirements in any of the anti-DEI laws that ban attending conferences that are restricted on the basis of race or identity. But the vagueness of this and other DEI laws creates real issues and just highlights how broken and unconstitutional these laws actually are. This is creating real challenges for our research enterprise. We're having difficulty identifying, recruiting, and retaining doctoral students and faculty of color in states where these bills have become law, and even in those where the university is interpreting other laws in ways that are creating challenges for them are leaving the states where they are working, creating real challenges for programs to fill that gap. Students don't have mentors who look like them to work with. There are whole areas of the research program that are unable to be explored because faculty are afraid of being targeted and not being able to do their work. There are examples of universities asking faculty members to alter their research projects, take away critical race theory from being a framework that they're discussing. There's even an example of a funded grant that is being held, waiting for them to make an official determination that that research plan does not run afoul to the anti-DEI bill in that state, jeopardizing the relationships that those faculty and those institutions are having with funders who still want to support our work. And in some cases, again, research efforts are being curtailed by their university's own interpretation of the law. In one Texas institution, faculty recently received a memo that while their DEI policy does not limit or prohibit their research activities, that research must meet the definition of true research as described, and that the identity-based aspects must be essential to the research. Well, who gets to make those determinations about what identity-based information is essential to the research? And what faculty are going to feel comfortable moving their entire program of research in that direction when the variability for them to do the work in that setting is unclear? So I know we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but I think for me, one of the things that this signals, and I've been thinking a lot about this after moving to Pitt from Florida, is the need for enhanced collaborative research and social work. We need to be working together. We need to work together to support each other in response to these threats, these very real threats that we're having to being able to do our work, and also where states and institutions that have more flexibility and less prohibition are able to partner and collaborate with researchers and institutions where very real barriers are preventing them from being able to do this critically important work. It is through our partnership and shared vision on getting through this time together that we're going to be able to succeed, and I'll talk more about that in our next section. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'd like to now pass it to Dr. Nepomnyaschy, who will talk about the consequences of anti-democratic initiatives.
Thank you. That was a hard act to follow. I'm supposed to talk today about anti-democratic initiatives across the country, their impact on the foundational principles of social work, the motives behind these initiatives, and how they affect our profession, our research, and marginalized communities that social workers serve. Mimi did a great job of introducing some of this, so I will skip over some of the things, but I do want to hit a few points that I think are really important. So Mimi also talked about this is a different group, Protect Democracy, which is a nonpartisan anti-authoritarian advocacy and research group, has created an authoritarian threat index for the US and several other countries. And they talk about this index for us today, and they update it every day. So you can see every single day it kind of shifts. We have a 2.4 out of 5. They call that a significant threat, 5 being a catastrophic threat. And they compute a 19% 4-year likelihood of democratic breakdown in the US. 19%. Not so high, but much higher, obviously, than we would like. And as Mimi pointed out, ours is higher than all of our kind of comparison countries: Canada, Germany, much lower, UK, Poland, 2.3, India is higher than us at 3.5. So, one of the things to think about is that democracy is eroding slowly, right? And Mimi also pointed to this. They talk about this sometimes as salami tactics, which is a term associated with Stalin and Hitler, who dismantled opposition very slowly, bit by bit. And Dr. Louise Richardson, I'll say more about her. She did a speech at Harvard. She's a former head of Oxford University. She said that the death of democracy is not likely to be an assassination from ambush. It will be a slow extinction from apathy, indifference, and undernourishment. And I want to come back to this thought about apathy, right? All of these things that are happening, to me, that's going to be my big point at the end, but I'll say it now, right? That's, to me, is what the motive is behind all of these things, to create apathy amongst people. So they think this Protect Democracy group thinks about 6 types of threats so that create this authoritarian index. So corrupting elections, we know, right, that the first thing authoritarians seek to do is to suppress the vote, particularly for groups who may not agree with their positions. We know all of those tactics, we're aware of those. I want to talk a little bit about one thing that we don't often talk about is ballot initiatives, which is another way that states are really undermining true kind of representative, the most direct democracy, right? So half of states in the US actually have this form of democracy where you can, citizens can put things on the ballot. And so several of these states have recently made laws making it much more difficult to get things on the ballot. You need more signatures, you have to get passage maybe in 2 separate elections, they disqualify signatures, and often this happens after successful measures that the legislatures did not like. For example, in Idaho, they decided to change how ballots are allowed to be, how ballots can be put on, how measures can be put on a ballot after there was a successful measure to expand Medicaid. In Arkansas, there was a successful measure to increase the minimum wage, and the Arkansas legislature decided to change the process. In Ohio, after many of you know, recently they passed abortion protections, and Ohio tried to change the threshold for getting something passed from 50 to 60%. And also in North Dakota, they passed a successful measure of term limits, and again, they changed how you do that now. And many of you probably know that in Florida recently there was also an abortion measure to protect abortion on the ballot in Florida. It passed, quote unquote, with 57% of people voting yes, but Florida has a 60% measure, so it didn't pass. And maybe this is another little piece, right? So you know also probably that in 2018, Florida voted to remove disenfranchisement from people who had a felony conviction. 65% of people voted for that, huge, right? And immediately then the state decided to add paying fines and fees as another kind of measure that was unattainable for people. And after that, they tried to change it to a 66.7% threshold, which caught through one house of the legislature, but then died. So again, right, chipping away at people's ability to control their lives and to control their communities. So, implications for social work, again, obviously it reduces political voice and power for the most marginalized groups. And again, it exacerbates this feeling of powerlessness, which I'm going to come back to. Weakening executive constraints, that's another thing that authoritarians do, right? They try to rewrite rules to strengthen executive power, weaken legislatures and the judiciary. We're seeing that here, certainly in the incoming administration. As Mimi also pointed out, they plan to strip the protections of civil service workers and to politicize the entire civil service workforce and to substantially reduce the federal workforce. I think probably people know this, right? The federal workforce over the last several decades is quite diverse. 19% of federal workers are Black Americans, and it has been over the last half a century a key avenue to middle class status for many Black Americans. So this will have devastating effects for particularly federal workers in DC, right, which is almost a nearly majority Black city, and that will have big implications certainly for social workers, because these are the people, right, who we serve. It will also have tremendous implications for research. We all, many of us who do quantitative work, rely on federal data, right? Getting rid of the federal workforce, or a large proportion of it, will impact tremendously our ability to get those data in a timely fashion for the kinds of research that we might want to do. As you know, like employment, income, poverty, demographic data all come from the federal government. We need them. And of course, it has implications for research funding, NIH, NSF, students' access to higher education, Pell Grants, work-study programs, and loan repayment programs. Another one of these threats is attacks on the media and science. And again, both Mimi and Kyaien talked about this. Authoritarians aim to weaken the press and public voices that contradict their narratives, including academics and scientists. You've heard the administration, the incoming administration, whose name I'm not going to use today, talk about media being the enemy of the people, right? There's lawsuits and threats to revoke broadcast licenses, and I'm sure you've all heard about ABC kowtowing to the administration and paying $15 million in a settlement with the incoming administration. And of course, attacks on higher education. I assume that many of you heard this, but maybe not, right? The incoming Vice President, J.D. Vance, in a 2021 speech to the National Conservatism Conference said publicly and very proudly that the professors are the enemy, right? The professors are the enemy. He was quoting Nixon. Nixon had said it very privately, right, on private tapes. Vance was very excited to say this in a very open and public way. And then there's the professor watch list. I assume people know about this. You can look it up, right? Anyone can report a professor for whatever, very convenient form. You can just pull it right up. You can search by name, university. All of our schools are there. We have faculty there. You can search by area, like LGBTQ, DEI, feminism, abortion, racial ideology, right? All these professors who said anything around those issues or study any of those issues are there. And of course, what are the implications for social work? So weakening of academic freedom, we've already talked about that. Silencing research does not conform to the administration's views. In the past, this has already happened, right? Gun violence research was not allowed, abortion research, stem cell research, and most recently, misinformation research. A group called the Stanford Internet Observatory, which looked for disinformation research, has collapsed, and all of the funding now for them is gone. So that's going to be a problem. And again, what does this do? It diminishes the public trust in science and institutions of higher education. It reduces the public's access to information, science, truth, and knowledge. And again, it pushes people towards apathy and towards not caring. Another one of these threats is weakening of civil liberties. So authoritarians scapegoat vulnerable communities. Does that sound familiar? They use demographics, so sexual, racial, ethnic, religious identities to sow division. So attacks on immigrants, as we know, is a direct threat to democracy. Attacks on LGBTQI populations are a direct threat to democracy, and obvious implications for social work, right? It has clear harm for these groups for whom social workers serve. One more that I want to talk about is stoking civil violence. That's the last kind of, not last, second to last. Authoritarians seek to incite and stoke political violence and civil unrest, quashing dissent and threatening protesters. We already know that they've talked about this, right? And what is the implications for this, right? So of this, sowing division between groups, amplifying our fears and distrust of each other. Absolutely, that's working well. Impairs the ability of practitioners to engage with and advocate for needs and rights of marginalized groups. It impairs the ability of researchers to collaborate with community members and to recruit participants for studies. I mean, it's a bad thing, that's a small thing, but for us, certainly for researchers, that matters tremendously. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the use of rhetoric, and this is back to kind of the apathy piece, to consistently chip away at public trust. One of the most dangerous things is spreading and stoking the claim that the system is broken. All politicians are corrupt, elections are rigged, the government is inherently evil. This incoming president actually embodies, right, all of those negative attributes. But what he does is he makes it look like, hey, dude, that's life, right? That's how it is. And people are buying it. And that's how people think, right, about the government. This continues this salami slicing, right? Slowly killing democracy by creating apathy where fewer people care, fewer people engage, fewer people vote, fewer and fewer people believe that they have the power to make change. And again, so the motives I've kind of talked about, but I just want to say, another motive I think here is this apathy thing, right? So the government works only for those with the loudest voices and the biggest pockets, cutting taxes, increasing the wealth of the wealthiest, continuing the creation of this class of oligarchs who are now openly buying influence, openly being promised all sorts of benefits, right, at the cost of the well-being of the rest of society. And just quoting Dr. Richardson again, she said, if people don't believe the government is anchored in public concern and committed to the public good, then they naturally turn to protecting only the people closest to them, so pulling back, and seeking influence through private channels or supporting anti-democratic charlatans claiming to speak for them. So that's my piece. And I have ideas, lots, to move ahead.
Thank you. I appreciate those comments, which we were laughing about will surely get us on a list if we aren't already. So we have about 30 minutes left. So what we're going to do with these 30 minutes is half of it, I'm going to ask a couple of questions to the panelists. And for the last half, we're going to open it up to Q&A. So the first question I'd like to pose to the panelists is around higher education. So how can social workers advocate for academic freedom and resist legislative or administrative attacks that stifle anti-racist and inclusive principles in higher education? And then what partnerships or coalitions could be leveraged to amplify these efforts? And if I can, I'd like to ask Mimi to comment first.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, well, I just want to say how much.
Sorry, Mimi, hold on, start over, we couldn't hear you, sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, so first of all, my co-panelists, your talks were terrific, and I was really impressed how we all covered the same territory from our own experience, and so it was very reinforcing, and I hope that the audience, given the repetition in our comments, really takes these threats to democracy and threats to higher education seriously. I've been thinking about how we push back, and it seems like we have what's been happening is two kinds of pushback. One is protection and one is resistance. And protection is kind of individual. You can think of it as protection or individual level resistance. So individual faculty and students are developing what some call creative compliance. So these are things that are being done, but there are also things that can be done if we want to do them. Rebranding. While some tenured faculty can hold the line, many, as already been mentioned, are rebranding their work by moving DEI items removing them from their syllabi, recasting their lectures. Universities, as you've been told already, have been creating alternative programs, changing the names of their DEI programs, integrating them into broader programs, and seeking support from alumni to help them continue the programs. Some faculty are and can leverage their research, resources, reputation, and networks to counter these politicized attacks on DEI initiatives. And there are reports on that one can look at there. People are doing that. In fact, as also been mentioned, faculty and students are protesting with their feet by avoiding or leaving universities and states with educational gag orders and going elsewhere. But fewer professors mean larger classrooms, less individual attention, and poorer learning outcomes. I just want to say a word. So those are things that people can do. I think our other panelists may have more things to say on that front, but they're kind of protection. They're holding the line. And as one of the panelists said, I think that they only go so far because they don't necessarily fool other people. The people who are opposed, who don't like what we're doing, they don't fool them and they will just come after us again, is my worry. So we need to think of also about collective resistance. So the Chronicle of Higher Education is tracking DEI laws state by state, and it's a great resource if you don't know what's going on in your states. The Association of University and College, AAUP, CSWE are speaking out. They're supporting fights against the attack on DEI, and you can find, I won't state their comments, but they have statements on their websites. The Ohio State University Board of Trustees and Iowa State 3 Regent universities defended their DEI programs against the Iowa House Republicans. So these are more resistance. These are less protective and more resistance. There are coalitions forming. Someone said we have to get together. Over 200 former college, university, and system heads have joined together in something called the Champions for Higher Education. Maybe some of you know about that. I'm just learning about that. It was created by PEN America. It's a united group. It's sharing its expertise and calling on institutions to forcefully oppose efforts of the kind we've been talking about. CSWE, NASW, SWR, and AAUP. I think they must treat anti-DEI and anti-democracy legislation as a high priority and respond to it quickly ahead of other institutional issues. Even better, they might actively coordinate efforts. And this is what I think we really have to do in the long run. I think all the other things, individual faculty, universities, even some coalitions, our major social work organizations have to actively coordinate efforts, issue collective statements, and speak in one voice in opposition to anti-DEI, and not just, we have to both protect and resist. And these organizations, it would be really great if they could take a stand on behalf of what we're so worried about.
Thank you, Mimi. So what I'm going to do is, we have 3 great questions. Each one's kind of focused on each area, and these are centered on strategies that we can all do to address these issues. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to ask each panelist just one question and just ask for you to respond in a couple of minutes. So Dr. Connor, this next one's for you around anti-DEI initiatives. So in what ways can social workers adapt their methodologies or community engagement strategies to sustain DEI-centered work despite restrictive policies?
Thank you so much. So, what's interesting, and I'll start just by saying this because this is a real sort of challenge right now. DEI in and of itself has become polarizing, just as has been the best way to counter these DEI attacks. I have personally seen that politicians will use whatever tools that they have, including cutting off finances and threats to try to eliminate DEI whenever they can. And there are a lot of folks who believe that without taking our eyes off of the mission, that what we should be doing is just trimming our sails, being a little bit less visible, trying to fly under the radar and be quiet until the storm passes. And then there are other folks on the other side of the coin who are saying, saying that we understand why people want to reduce visibility, and we can understand the need or the inclination to not want to become a target, but that once we start to reduce the visibility of our DEI initiatives, that we then become even more vulnerable. And that if we begin to start allowing ourselves to let other people and politicians dictate what we can and cannot teach in the classroom and how we're identifying our institutions and the kind of research that we're doing, then are we really universities anymore? And ultimately, this is going directly against the principles that our professions stand for. So how do we grapple with this? And I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I have all of the answers, but what I do want to share are what some institutions are doing right now. And there's sort of a balance, in my opinion. I think that we have to be, we have to be a little bit radical, and we also have to be a little bit practical. I think that we have to be visionary, but we also have to be realistic. We have to be creative. We have to use strategy. I think we have to use all of these things and work together to get through. A couple of the key things I mentioned earlier that are sort of the main areas that many of these DEI laws are targeting, the first being DEI offices and roles. And I think it's really important. I think most of us know this, but what we're seeing most people do are just rebrand and rename some of these offices and roles. And I know that that doesn't sit well with everybody, but as many people have talked about at this conference, words are words, and we can use other words. What is more important, being able to hold on to this acronym or being able to do the work that's actually helping our communities and our schools and our students and our faculty? It is not the words or the acronym that is the most important. And often people ask me, well, what are other people doing? So I'll give you a couple names that aren't that bad. The Division of Opportunities, Connections, and Success, the Office of Access and Engagement, the Multicultural Student Services Center, the Office of Inclusive Excellence, the Division of Inclusive Culture and Belonging, the Office of Engagement and Retention, the Office of Transformational and Inclusive Excellence. These workarounds are helping many institutions, in particular in places where resistance is strong, to continue to do the important work that they need to do. These are strategies that we can also employ. I think it's also really important. I know we don't have time to talk about this all, but we have different institutions have a different situational ability in this particular fight that we're in. Some universities don't have the same ability as others to be able to stick their heels in and fight back and push back. Others do. And so we have to be able to be flexible and understand that some schools or some faculty aren't weak because they've just kind of given up on this fight. They may not have the same resources that others do. We have to be able to partner and work together and understand some of those unique differences. I was present when New College of Florida tried to fight back. And if you didn't see this, go online and you will see it. Because in a 60-minute board of directors meeting that was streamed publicly, virtually, their entire board of directors and president were fired and replaced on the spot because they chose to fight back. They didn't have the resources, but other institutions may. How can we help one another? There are a lot of workarounds to the removal of diversity statements. This is something that's already being removed from many institutions, even in states where there aren't anti-DEI laws. But there are other ways that we can still get that information and prioritize hiring and admitting underrepresented students. We can look at more holistic approaches to how we are analyzing that. The Davis scale that came out of California looks at other things in applications like socioeconomic status and first-generation status and growing up in medically underserved communities. There are other ways we can ask the questions to still get the same kind of information that don't directly become targets. I have a lot of examples of this that I'm really happy to share. The other big target is mandatory DEI trainings. Well, if you don't have to make them mandatory, then just don't make them mandatory. We know from research that oftentimes mandatory DEI trainings don't work anyway. But there are other ways that we can do this. We can embed mandatory DEI concepts from training into broader concepts like cultural humility or inclusive excellence, which often overlap the same principles as DEI, but don't make us direct targets to some of these laws. We can also build more relationships with community partners. I see community partners from Pittsburgh here tonight. Folks who care about DEI, we can work to build more relationships with them. They can help to support some of our efforts. We can do these kinds of trainings in community instead of in the institutions where we're working to make sure that we're not running afoul to some of these laws. I also want to highlight, and I know we're not talking about pedagogy, but often the research that we are doing is making its way into the classroom. And so I really want to highlight this because one of the critical things that we really need to do is make sure that we have sufficiently integrated DEI content into our entire curriculum and that it is not wrapped up in a few DEI focused courses. Now, I know a lot of institutions are doing this, including my own, but if we were to go and look at our curriculum, I'm sure many of us could point out those DEI courses. They are like shining a big banner over here, and they are going to be the first thing to be eliminated if a federal DEI ban comes. And if those courses were to be cut, would there be enough integration of DEI content throughout the rest of your curriculum for your students to be able to be successful in going out and working in diverse spaces to do good community-based participatory research? If not, this is something that we need to be thinking about critically, because these kinds of laws can come quickly and swiftly without enough time to go back and try to make changes later. And then the last thing, I know, research as a strategy to counter DEI resistance. I talked about this a minute ago in regards to our ability to work directly and partner with institutions where we're already seeing significant bans and their inability to do some of this work. But also it is our responsibility to be engaging in empirical research that shines a light on the benefit of DEI programs. We need empirical, robust evidence that showcases the importance of DEI initiatives, how it is helping our institutions, how it is improving our communities, how it is benefiting our organizations and companies. We need that evidence. We need that so that we can share that with the public, so that we can counter the misinformation that is out there, so that we can give that to politicians so that they better understand what they are doing and how these anti-DEI legislation is hurting us in ways that they may not even understand. That is important, and that is something that we can be doing as social workers. And last plug, the Journal on Race and Social Problems at the University of Pittsburgh is putting out a special edition that is targeting empirical studies that are looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion. So if you are doing this work, if you know someone doing this work, we want to make it really easy for our advocates to have one place that houses a lot of this information so that we can use this in the fight against anti-DEI. Thank you.
Okay, and the last question to the panel, Dr. Nepomnyaschy, is how can social workers uphold democratic principles such as participatory decision-making and open dialogue in research and practice when faced with anti-democratic trends?
Hi. Okay. So I don't have an exact answer to that, but I do want to say that universities should be the primary institutions that can and must nurture and protect democracy and fight back against these anti-democratic forces, because we don't have anybody else, really. So the universities bring together people from diverse backgrounds to engage in intellectual inquiry, critical thinking, and evidence-based debates and discussion. This is where we should be having those conversations. Universities are the key to be pushing back, right? And again, Dr. Richardson, she's this great essay, so I'm going to quote her really quickly. Universities can become staunch bastions of truth, holding the eroding line of balance and accountability, preventing the flood of misinformation from overwhelming the digital commons. And one of the things that specifically that I thought about was that universities can be the providers of information, right? When there's all the stuff out there is bad, we can be doing that, right? So our communications departments put out the research that we do, awesome, great, right? All our achievements and accomplishments, but they can also be putting out truth, right? We can be joining public radio, public libraries, right? To be actually creating journalism in some ways, right? Of just reporting what is actually going on. And that can be our responsibility, as in universities. You know, when you think about schools of social work, I mean, we particularly should be the leaders in this pursuit. Our code of ethics, our mission, there is no other discipline or profession that is better suited to stand up to these attacks than social work, because it's in our DNA, as they say. I thought I had one other thing. We could think about a legal defense fund that provides protection and lawyers for researchers who get attacked out there, Professor Watch, because obviously, you know, it's incredibly expensive, right, to protect yourself, and universities may not want to protect you, right? And so thinking about foundations or somebody who cares about this, or lawyers, to help protect faculty. That's all I have for now. But
Thank you. Okay, at this point, we would like to open it up to Q&A. So if anyone has questions, there's microphones on both aisles.
Hello, Chanel Dupree, and I am the executive director of a nonprofit called the Racial Equity Collaborative, and we work to address disparities in the child welfare system regarding Black and brown children. So my training is legal. So I'm an attorney, and I worked in this space, and right, of course, we form an organization called the Racial Equity Collaborative in this climate. But my question specifically is regarding the collaboration and the connection with the legal community, because you were talking a lot, of course, about social workers and working across universities, but there are legal institutions, there are organizations that are primed for the fight, right? The ACLU, the NAACP, just very historic, well-respected organizations that have done this work and seen what it has taken. So I'm just wondering if there could be some cross-collaboration between professions to assist in what is coming, because this is the thing, people pass laws, they do things all the time, and they do it unless it's checked and it's actually brought to the courts, brought to the judges to challenge whether this is actually constitutional or not. So I'm just wondering if there's been any conversation about that, or just what your takeaways are with that.
Well, first, I just want to say thank you for the work that you're doing and for creating this organization in this time, difficult but so incredibly important. And please, we want to get your contact information after this. I didn't have time to talk about it clearly, but I do 100% agree with you. And there's two things that I want to highlight. Currently, I am named in a lawsuit against the state of Florida. And so, I have recognized the very important role that legal institutions and community-based legal entities can have in partnering with academics individually, but also with units and schools to, go all the way from just providing support and information all the way up to filing actual lawsuit. One of the other things that I wanted to mention that I think is critically important is that as we're making these decisions and strategies in, university settings about how we want to strategize, how we want to counter these DEI attacks, we need legal guidance, because we're not lawyers. I wasn't trained to be able to read these bills, and they don't make any sense. They are not clear. And it's on purpose. And what's really frustrating is that often the legal guidance that we're getting from the lawyers in our institutions have the institution or their leadership, benefit that's what they're thinking about. They're not thinking about us. So it's really important for us to have people in community that care about DEI, that care about the work that we're doing, that we can say, hey, how can we do as much as we can, but still be able to not directly run afoul to this law? And should we choose to stand up and fight against it, we need strategies and support to do that effectively. And so these kind of collaborations are critically important, 100%.
If I could just add one little thing, Justin, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Mimi.
Just one little thing that, as I understand it, there are at least 13 different lawsuits currently pending against these educational gag laws through the ACLU, the NAACP, Legal Defense Fund, and so on. And they're really important. But while we want to get legal assistance on our end, the legal profession might want to turn to us for some of their argumentation, because we have things to say and understand about the impact of this on people in communities that is unique to social work. So I think that needs to be a two-way street. And if I could just say one other thing, I don't want to sound pessimistic, but all these wonderful practical strategies that we are developing, we absolutely have to do them. They're a must. But as I made a slight reference to it in my comments, I'm worried that we won't be fooling anybody. All those alternative names, everybody knows what they are. They're not fooling anybody. And so at some point, I think we have to do much more than all that rebranding, much more than all that, what I call protection, all those protection things. We really have to get the profession, to work with lawyers in large numbers, but also if our leaders don't stand up, we are not going to stand up. If our leaders don't get together, we'll be isolated. They'll be isolated from each other. I don't know if that's happening. It may be happening behind the scenes, but I think if there's one thing we could do through SWR and other organizations is to try to initiate some kind of inter-social work organizational conversation about this, because whether you're SWR, NASW, CSWE, whatever, we're all going to go down together unless we find a way to fight back collectively. And in that way, that will embolden practitioners and social work educators to do the kind of things that we've already discussed, because otherwise fear is going to take over. So I think we really have to, think of all these positive things to do and practical things to do, but beware that the people who are on the other side are not stupid, and they can see through it. And we have to figure out a way to get more protection in the form of collective resistance.
Thank you, Mimi.
I was going to say that there's lawsuits constantly being filed. I mean, what Mimi's saying, right? So just because a state passes something doesn't mean it's going to be on the books. I mean, and they want us to be scared, right? I mean, that's part of the point. And as you said, those laws are written incredibly not clear for the exact purpose of making people not know what to do and create fear and chilling. So.
Yeah, and if I may add, one thing that Mimi said made me think, or her pessimism and her concern about us moving forward, is that we've been through this before. And the Social Welfare History Group, we put out a bibliography, which Mimi led, on the Red Scares, and it's a very detailed bibliography with kind of introductions to different issues. And if you look back on our past, during Red Scares, we've experienced this, but also, one thing that happened then that I think is an important thing to remember now is we say, social work should do this, social work should do that, but back then, social workers were turning against each other and ratting each other out. And so I think it's important to recognize that. I think that we have to recognize that there's social workers that are happy with these bans. And so then, what do we, how do we, organize around these issues and, and create counter strategies when at the same time we may need to be protected and guarded with some of our interactions with our colleagues who may not hold those same views or wish that that social work take a stance against them.
Ew.
Oh, come on, Lenna, you can do better than that.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. We have another question.
Just on the topic of social workers turning on each other, I was thinking about how I tortured myself and watched the full hearings every time they interrogated university presidents over the Palestinian encampments and protests, and how often those interrogations turned into interrogations around DEI. Like they would start with Palestine, and then they would start asking what some people would interpret as completely separate questions about DEI and affirmative action in these same hearings. And so I'm curious how, just if anyone would want to speak to where that fits in the profession's responsibility, and if the way the universities are showing up for that, like how that's working in concert with or against, because the legislature is coupling it, like they're trying to use it as its own kind of dog whistle. And, yeah.
So just so I can understand, I want to make sure I fully understand the question. Did you mean that where does the conversation about what's happening in Palestine connect with the anti-DEI? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and the strategies that like schools of social work are using, we're like being really silent around trans and immigration issues, and sometimes really vocal in different ways on particular issues. So I'm just wondering, issue specific, how that's looking. I apologize if it's not a super.
No, that's okay. I mean, I'll do my best to, and I hope that this is an answer to the question, and I don't know if I have a full answer, but I think all these topics are connected. And I think that one of the challenge is that similarly, in faculty, in our schools are being limited with a lot of pressure from a lot of different sources on what we can do, what we can't do, in this very similar ways that these DEI bans are creating confusion about what we can do, what we can't do. I know for me personally, I've had to have very awkward conversations with provosts and presidents about, well, we would like for you to talk about things this way, but don't use this language. Be very careful about how you talk about this. Remember that whenever you speak, because of the role that you're in, you're representing the university and not just yourself. And then these things create anxiety in us about not knowing how we should respond, and whether or not as an individual, if I'm allowed to have an opinion that may go against what the larger university is saying, and if I say something that then garners a lot of attention that the university doesn't like, is my position at risk? Are the positions of all the students that work in my center now at risk because of something that I said that the university didn't like? I think that these are real challenges because these are things we should be talking about and we should be strategizing on together. And I think we don't have enough time in 3 minutes to kind of talk about that fully here, but I think that these are things that we should be talking about here at SWR more broadly. How can we work together to think about how we want to handle these significant challenges that are very strongly impacting the health and mental health and well-being of our students and faculty in ways that are, these are complex situations, but what I don't like is the fact that we're unable or uncomfortable to talk about it. We may not all like each other's answers or how we want to respond. I talked at the beginning of this about how people, even people who agree with me on the DEI piece, have very different ideas about what we should be doing. Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about the pros and cons and what we should be doing as a profession and make some decisions and not relegate these conversations to some little corner where we can't really have a robust conversation. We have to talk about it. And I don't know the answer, but I'm glad that you were willing to bring it here because it is something we have to talk about and make decisions about as a profession.
If I can add something, I think that what I understood the question to be is that I would say that there are various issues coming up on the campus, all the ones you mentioned, the questioner mentioned, but they're all being weaponized, but they're being weaponized differently. And so, we don't have time to go through all those differences, but I think everyone in the room knows the differences. And the purpose of the weaponizing is to divide people. Whatever the issue is, it's going to divide people, whether it's the Palestinian issue, the DEI, woke, whatever, transgender, they get in the cracks of our solidarity. And so I think the thing to think about them all is that the critics are weaponizing them, and we cannot let them weaponize it. That our job is to stop, expose the weaponization and stop them from doing it, because otherwise they will continue to divide us as they have done on all the issues that you've mentioned.
Thank you, Mimi. So we're up on time. I want to thank the panelists for their great comments and thoughts and strategies to address these issues. So let's do one quick round of applause again.
Justin, thank you for organizing. Thank you for organizing.
Yes,
Of course, thank you. And I mean, and clearly this will be with what is happening politically, this will be an ongoing discussion. So, maybe we'll have resisting regression 3 until we get through this together. So thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. Thank you.